Hey, let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Genesis chapter 37, we're getting into the story of Joseph. And in this lesson, we're going to look at Joseph's interaction with his brothers and how they betray him and ultimately send him to Egypt. Acts 17:11 reminds us to receive the word with great eagerness, but examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. So we're going to learn that Joseph is favored by Jacob. So Jacob has not learned any lessons from parents picking favorites, just as his parents did. He's going to repeat that again. Joseph is going to tell the first pair of dreams that he has, and first pair of three pairs that he's actually going to be involved in his story. So we'll get into that. We'll look at his brother's jealousy and conspiracy against him. He'll be sent off to Egypt. And ultimately, his other sons will deceive Jacob along the way, just as Jacob himself deceived his own father. This central road that runs through the heart of the country is called the Way of the Patriarchs for a reason, because all of the patriarchs traveled up and down it, and we'll see Joseph traveling up and down it here. Joseph is clearly Jacob's favored son. He shares his unpopular dreams about his family bowing down, and that leads to animosity. And so we have this, that's how this scene starts. And he's going to start off at Hebron, and then rather inexplicably, Jacob is going to tell Joseph, go find your brothers. We think they're in Shechem. So Shechem's up here at number 2. And then he gets to Shechem and can't find them, but then someone else says, oh no, they moved on to Dothan. And so Dothan is where the shenanigans with his brother take place, and he's eventually sold into slavery. The Ishmaelites bought him along the Via Maris, which is the way of the sea, which passes all the way down to Egypt. And so that's the green map that you can see there. And we'll go ahead and zoom in. You can see this region more clearly. So the Ishmaelites traveled from the region of Gilead, which is across the Jordan River, and they move on to Dothan, and they move all the way down. So Dothan is one of the 3 mountain passes that connect the coastal plain to the Jezreel Valley. So they would have had to run through one of these 3 cities. Megiddo is the other famous one, by the way, one of the other 3. There's a town called Beth Shean. That's a famous city that we'll visit when we go to Israel. This connects the Jezreel Valley to the Jordan Rift. And so it's likely that the Ishmaelite traders followed this green route to Dothan and then on down to Egypt. Now Jacob lived in the land where his father lived as a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generation of Jacob. Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers when he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Genesis 25:19 contains this statement, these are the generations of Isaac, and that served to introduce us to the Jacob story. And so as if to say, here's the story now of Isaac's offspring. So the same thing is happening here with Jacob now giving way to Joseph, and Joseph will be the central figure really through the rest of the book of Genesis. Chapter 35, we remember, ended with Isaac dying, and so by the statement in verse 1, we can see that Jacob has now fully inherited Isaac's estate. The mention of Joseph's age indicates that chapter 37 took place very soon after the events of chapter 35, when Benjamin was around a year old. So it says Joseph was 17 years of age, and curiously, the number 17 is going to reappear at the end of the book. Genesis 47:28, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. So you got the 17 sort of factoring in here. Joseph was 17 years old when he loses, he and Jacob are going to part after this, and they won't see each other again until Jacob has 17 years left. So this thought of brought back a bad report, we just don't know what that means. In general, not much bad can be said about Joseph. Some would even go so far as to say there's nothing bad, no sin recorded about Joseph. So without knowing what the bad report is, we don't know whether Joseph here is engaging in youthful, he's only 17, so was he engaging in petty gossip and tattling, or was it something so alarming that Joseph had a responsibility to sound the alarm? So we just aren't told what Joseph's motive is here. Ezekiel 36, if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the horn, and the people are not warned, and a sword comes and takes a person from them, he is taken away for his wrongdoing, I will require blood. So the watchman has a duty to sound the alarm, and we don't know if that's what Joseph was doing here. I do suggest we give him the benefit of the doubt, and we conclude that he acted with integrity. And so for all we know, Jacob had sent Joseph into the field and instructed him to bring back a report about what was going on with these sons, and so Joseph was obligated to bring back a bad report. In any case, either way, it's clear that Jacob's family is filled with rivalry and tension. And we've got several parallels of Joseph to Jesus, and we'll just list a couple of these, and we'll list these as we go along. But here we see that Joseph was pasturing the flock, and of course Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And whatever it was, Joseph was opposed to evil. So if we take the most charitable view of it, Joseph was fighting back against evil that his half-brothers were plotting. So we have this opposition to evil, and that's of course what Jesus was about as well. Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a multicolored tunic, and his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. So this is interesting. We've got this dysfunctional favoritism here by saying that Israel loved Joseph more. And so it's interesting that his name switches from Jacob to Israel here. And so that gives us a hint that maybe something spiritual was going on here. Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born, so definitely a son of his old age. And perhaps unwittingly, by giving him this garment, Jacob has now designated Joseph for a life of misery with respect to his brother. So he's calling him out, making no bones about it that Joseph is his favorite. This coat, whatever it was one that signified status. And so now all of the other brothers would have had a visual reminder of the favoritism. Multicolored coats would be something a king wore. So definitely status and royalty. Jacob was conferring this on Joseph. This term, they were unable to speak friendly, in the underlying Hebrew is the word shalom, which means peace. So they were unable to speak peace with him. The basic Hebrew greeting that's been used for millennia is shalom aleichem, and that just means peace be with you. Muslims have a very similar greeting, peace be with you. The brothers in this case were unable to even utter the simplest, superficial, polite greeting to Joseph. That's how much they hated him. So this underpinning of hatred was running really deep here. So that just reminds us that as disciples of Jesus, we need to prevent envy from ever creeping into our lives. It's just something we need to be on guard against, because it's something that starts small, but it just ends up just festering, and you end up with base hatred. You don't even remember why you hated the person. You just remember that you do. The types of Messiah here, numerous. He was beloved by his father, clothed with royalty, just as Jesus was, hated and envied by his brothers. He was hated because of who he was and because of what he said. And so you got both of this going on here, and all of that applies to Jesus. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had, and behold, we were binding sheaves, basically sheaves of wheat in the field, and behold, my sheaf stood up and also remained standing, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Then his brother said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us? Two different Hebrew words there. So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. This is going to be the first of 3 pairs of dreams that Joseph will be involved in. These 2 are his own. Then we're going to see in prison he's going to interpret the dreams of the baker and the butler. And then later he will interpret 2 dreams by Pharaoh regarding the 7 years of plenty and followed by 7 years of famine. Dreams were considered divine revelation in the ancient world, especially when the receiver of the dream is a person of importance. So by bestowing on Joseph the robe, the garment, that signified he was royalty. And that gives a little extra, credibility to the fact that he is interpreting his own dreams here. Joseph's importance though is hidden from his family at the moment, and it will continue all the way through until they're in Egypt and Joseph reveals himself. So while some dreams required interpretation, others just didn't. And in this case, the brothers clearly understood the meaning and understood what Joseph was getting at here. In the first dream, Joseph is going to reign supreme over the 12 tribes. And that's literally true, because at the end, he's going to receive Jacob's double portion. But it's interesting that they hated him even more. Is actually a pun on Joseph's name. And I've got the word Yosef in blue there, while the rest of it is in that maroon color. Basically, it says they added to their hate. So Joseph in Hebrew means to add to. And so they added to their hatred of Joseph. So you have this pun on added to. Then he had another dream, and yet informed his brothers of it, and said, "Behold, I have had another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He also told it to his father as well as his brothers. His father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you have had? Am I and your mother and your brothers actually going to come down and bow down to you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So we have to question your mother. Why is he mentioning Rachel here? Because Rachel has passed away, and yet we have an obvious hint here of life after death. Rachel is still alive spiritually, and she will have yet a role to play, something that Jeremiah will pick up, Rachel weeping for her children, and Matthew is going to pick up as well in the Gospels. So some commentators might list this as another mistake by Joseph, perhaps in youthful indiscretion, notwithstanding he should have just kept these two dreams for himself. Jacob is initially irked. He initially rebukes Jesus, but then resolves to ponder these things in his heart. He knows his line is important, and he knows there's something special about Joseph. So kind of after thinking about it, he's kind of wondering what's going on here. So as with the earlier bad report, we don't know for certain whether Joseph is boasting here, or whether because there were oracles from God, he was duty bound to report the dreams. So we just aren't sure. So was he boasting? We don't know. There are over 100 ways in which Joseph is a foreshadow of Jesus, as we've been talking about. So because of this, I'm inclined to believe that Joseph was not sinning by tattling earlier or boasting here. He is prefiguring Jesus' sinlessness. Not to say that Joseph was sinless, but only that with these two possible exceptions, there's no other sin of Joseph that's recorded. And so that's interesting. Only he and Daniel have that distinction of having no evil written of him. Again, if you take the position that he was not boasting here. So regardless of which position one takes, there'll be nothing negative spoken of Joseph for the remainder of Genesis. And if you think about all the times where he would have occasion to gripe or complain or shake his fist, and he doesn't. And that's really the big lesson for us when we study the life of Joseph. So here, types of Messiah, he had these dreams of future royalty, future sovereignty, and a prophetic destiny. And of course, Jesus had all those as well. Verse 12, his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel, not Joseph, not Jacob, said to Joseph, "Are your brothers not pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "I will go." And he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron and came to Shechem. So interesting, the bring word back is going to be many, many, many years later when Joseph sends word to his father that his brothers are okay. And so that's fascinating. Come down. We're all okay here. And so Joseph will abide by this, but he won't get the opportunity to do it in the short term. So Hebron to Shechem, we got this little fly-in video here. Probably about a 3-day journey in that day from Hebron up to Shechem, and then maybe another day's journey to Dothan, which is about 14 miles to the northwest. And again, it's in this mountainous region, so probably would have been slow going. Dothan empties out into a plain area that gives you a valley in between the mountains. So it's a very well-traveled route that was in the ancient world. several unanswered questions here that I thought of. So kind of what were they doing in Shechem of all places? By mentioning Shechem in conjunction with the story of Joseph's abduction, I think the city is indirectly becoming associated with another atrocity. But, what were the boys doing in Shechem to begin with? I'm sure Jacob would have remembered what was going on, what happened there, and the outrage that the people would have had against him. And so, why would they have been there in the first place? Why did Jacob send Joseph alone to his brothers when he knew of this animosity, or he should have known? So that's interesting. And then why would he send him wearing the garment of royalty that was in fact their symbol of hatred? So we just aren't sure. We don't have any firm answers of this, but all we can say is that the hand of God was working to accomplish his purposes. We don't know why. A lot of these don't make sense, and a lot of what happens here won't make any sense at all until we see the bigger picture. It's interesting that Joseph will later be buried in Shechem by Joshua, so they'll make note of Joseph's bones will be in Shechem. So again, we have this subtle shift from Jacob to Israel, and so there's this hint that although something bad is about to happen to Joseph, the mission is in fact serving a spiritual purpose. So whenever you see the word Israel instead of Jacob, it's just something you want to take note of, that there's a spiritual lesson happening here. When Joseph says, "I will go," it's actually the Hebrew word hineni, which is usually translated as "here I am," but here it is translated as "I will go." And so what's interesting to me is the original readers would have been clearly reminded of Genesis 22, where both Abraham and Isaac said this term hineni to indicate their willingness to be obedient on a very difficult assignment. And so that's what Joseph has here, and yet he is saying the same thing, I will go. So God in chapter 22 told Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son, even Isaac, and Abraham said, "Hineni, here I am." He calls out at one point to Isaac, and then Isaac says, "Here I am." And so now we've got the same word used here. So just as Isaac died, though, interesting, there's a thought that Isaac was dead to Abraham as soon as the command came. And so there's a type, and Paul picks up on this in the New Testament, where actually when he was spared, supernaturally, he was thought to be resurrected. And so, too, Joseph will soon die in Jacob's eyes. He will think that he's dead, only to be resurrected later in Genesis. So we've got these themes of death and resurrection running through here. Verse 14 is curious. It says, "Seek the welfare," but again in Hebrew, it says, "Inquire about their shalom," inquire about their peace. So after the events of Simeon and Levi at Shechem we mentioned earlier, Joseph probably would have been worried about his son's well-being. But the same shalom, the same peace the brothers are unable to speak to Joseph, Joseph will try to bring to his brothers. So a lesson for disciples is we do not pay evil with evil. Here's a picture of some sheep pasturing in the Shechem region. The fact that they're this far north from Hebron suggests that we are in the summer or early fall. We'll have another clue of that when we get to Dothan. There's a very big clue that it's the dry time of year. So the rainy season is from November to March, and so this area around Hebron would have had plenty of grass for the flock to feed. But as the summer heat came, the grass dies out, the flocks would have had to seek higher ground where edible vegetation would have persisted. So, and then as fall turns to winter, the higher areas get too cold and they have to move back down to lower elevation. So it's this, shepherds were constantly on the move, looking for the kind of the optimal ground for pasturing their flocks. We have these two cities here. So we've got Hebron and Shechem kind of juxtaposed here. And it's interesting, those same two cities will be in the time of David. So David will initially rule from Hebron before he moves the capital to Jerusalem. And then after Solomon dies, Jeroboam will be the rebel who divides the nation, and he will rule from Shechem. So you kind of got this hint of something not quite right with Shechem that runs throughout the Old Testament. And so our messianic parallels, again, he's sent forth by his father on a mission that will, from one perspective will not end well, but that's why he was sent. And then he also goes to Shechem, which is where the scene of John chapter 4 takes place, and the Samaritan woman at the well. So they're traveling these probably the exact same roads that Jesus will eventually travel. Joseph is traveling here. A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They have moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. So here is this a picture of the Dothan area. So it's hilly, but it gives way to very fertile areas and a very flattened area where the big international highway passed through. So Dothan was actually a formidable city in the ancient period. Probably it gets overshadowed by Megiddo, but it's that same type of importance. You had to control that city. If you control that city, then you controlled the trade that ran through all the way from Egypt all the way through Mesopotamia and then even up into Europe about that way. So again, we're about 14 miles from Shechem. Commanded one of the three passes that you had to go through to get to points inland from the coastal region. There's a big mountain range that kind of runs diagonally, and there's Dothan was one of the passes that allowed passage through there. So this unnamed man is interesting. If this man doesn't meet Joseph, Joseph never would have ended up in Egypt. But if this man doesn't meet Joseph, then Jacob's family wouldn't have survived the famine. So this unnamed man actually is quite pivotal to our story here. Types of Messiah here, Joseph is labeled a wanderer, and so Jesus will say, "I have no place to lay," the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And ultimately, he is seeking the lost sheep, his lost brothers, and that's exactly what Jesus did as well. When they saw him from a distance before he came closer to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We will say a vicious animal devoured him. Then we will see what becomes of his dream." So here we see this progression from jealousy to hate to conspiracy to murder. And it's interesting that Jesus talks about this in Matthew 5. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, "You good for nothing," shall be guilty. Whoever says, "You fool," shall be guilty enough to go into Gehenna. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your offering and then go and be reconciled. So the brothers don't do this here. They are plotting against him. They let envy turn into anger, and they're calling him names here, mockingly calling him a dreamer. And so we've got this progression that will ultimately wind up with what they think is going to be his murder. This interesting word, distance, also recalls Genesis 22. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. So again, a parallel here. And so this type of Messiah, he becomes the victim of a conspiracy, just as Jesus was. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let's not take his life." Then Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into the pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, so that later he might rescue him out of their hands to return him to his father." So as firstborn, Reuben probably needed to take even more of a leadership role than this, but at the very least, he talks him into sparing Joseph's life for at least for the moment. Reuben, again, would have, as the eldest, would have been ultimately responsible for everyone's safety. And so it's interesting. Later, Reuben will remind the brothers of their mistake. Reuben answered them, saying, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now justice for his blood is required." And so it's interesting that he gets this. Apparently, he didn't plan on the curveball that's about to be thrown by Judah, which we'll get to in verse 26. He's defended by one of his brothers, and that calls the Nicodemus standing in front of the Sanhedrin, saying, "Does our law permit him to be accused?" And they kind of, everyone else kind of jumps at him, saying, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it." So he has this one lone defender. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped him of his tunic, the multicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. curiously enough. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels carrying labdanum, resin, balsam, and myrrh on their way to bring him down to Egypt. So here really begins Joseph's suffering, and we have to wonder how they could callously eat a meal given what's about to transpire here. But they're showing no remorse here. Cisterns were often muddy. And we have this line in Jeremiah 38 where Jeremiah was thrown into a pit and basically began to sink in the mud. But it's very interesting. The scripture tells us that this one is dry, indicating it's also the end of the dry season in late summer. And we'll have some other things to say about that in our live teaching. But it's interesting that the Bible goes out of its way to tell us that the cistern is dry, because usually cisterns are filled with water, and but this one wasn't. So likely the brothers removed the valuable coat. They didn't want it muddied or soiled so they could sell it or something, but they will end up soiling it to cover up their crime, curiously enough. Jeremiah 38, they took Jeremiah and threw him into the cistern of Malchijah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard of the guardhouse, and they let Jeremiah down with ropes. Now, in the cistern, there was no water, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank into the mud. So normally it would be filled with water. You have this opening in the top where they would lower the pail, but hey, it also served as a handy prison cell. You could lower the body through there by ropes and all that. So on day one of our Israel tour, we visit a cistern in Bet Shemesh, and we kind of get this feeling for what it would have been like to be locked in a cistern. And fortunately now there's stairs, but back then it would have been a very prison cell. So basically this is a handmade carving. It's basically the soft limestone, easy to carve, and they plaster it, and it holds water from the rainy season so that they have some water to see them through the dry season. So now we see the fact that they are in Dothan. It becomes very significant, because unlike most other locations in our narrative thus far, Shechem and Bethel and Hebron, those weren't on any kind of major trade routes. But here, this is on a major trade route. International travelers would have passed by frequently. And for God to get Joseph down to Egypt to save his family, he needed to use these major roads. And so it's interesting, in the same way, Jesus moved his ministry from a tiny backwater town of Nazareth to Capernaum, which is also on this same road, International Way, and that's how the gospel was spread in the ancient world, using those famous Roman roads. So God will use things like this, and He'll move us along to accomplish His purposes. So it's curious that these spice items are listed. Here you can see a picture of myrrh that's on display. And so myrrh was one of the 3 gifts that was brought by the wise men in Matthew 2. And it specifically had a use in embalming and becomes associated with burial. And so they will talk about burying Jesus and giving myrrh and aloe, that kind of thing. So thus we have myrrh associated with Joseph, just as it will be associated with Jesus later. So our types of Messiah here, he was insulted, mocked, stripped of his garments, cast into a pit, and then that can be a double meaning, because he was thrown into the prison of Caiaphas, and also the pit is also a metaphor for death. I descend into the pit, which means I die, I go into the tomb. And so we've got that here. And also the mention of spices are prominent in both Joseph and the Messiah. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our own hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." How noble of Judah here. And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him out and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. So they brought Joseph into Egypt. So the sequence becomes a little bit murky here. Walton, in his commentary, suggests that the Midianite and Ishmaelite terms are being used interchangeably. Perhaps to literally not lay a hand on him, the brothers hired the Midianites to sell, basically broker the deal with the Ishmaelites for Joseph, and then they both end up getting paid. So we aren't exactly sure what the sequence is here, but ultimately Joseph is sold into slavery and taken to Egypt. Lots of types of Messiah here. So we've got lifted from the pit, which is a foreshadow of Jesus's resurrection, sold for silver. And it's interesting that Judah orchestrates the deal here, and Judas, which is a Greek name for Judah, will do it later for Jesus. He's involuntarily taken to Egypt. So remember, just as Jesus was born, there was the order to kill all the babes in Bethlehem. The Holy Family sneaks away to Egypt and sojourns there for a time. We don't know where Reuben was, but now he returns to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not there. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" Meaning he's responsible. So what's he going to do? So they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the tunic in blood. So it's interesting, the boy is not there has a lot of rich meaning there. The same word will be used later in Jeremiah 31 when it says, "A voice is heard in Ramah, lamenting and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children because the children are no more." So you got a related word used there. And this verse will later be cited by Matthew as describing how Jesus escaped to Egypt, interestingly enough. So you have all of this parallelism going on here, as we talked about when King Herod ordered the killing of the children of Bethlehem. We aren't told why Reuben is surprised that Joseph isn't there, but he does know that Jacob will hold him accountable for everyone's safety. And so it's interesting that the brothers don't. They kind of neglect to tell Reuben what happened, but they're just going to say, "Hey, look, let's go make up the story that he was killed." This garment dipped in blood reminds us of Revelation 19:13. He, meaning Jesus, is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. So symbolism there. So the type of Messiah here is he is not here. They go to the pit, and Reuben exclaims he is not there. And that's just like Jesus was resurrected. And the angel tells the women he is not here, he has risen. And they sent the multicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Of course, they know full well it's his. Then Jacob examined and said, "It is my son's tunic. A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." In the very next chapter, we're going to see something very similar where Tamar brings Judah's garments and says, "Please examine and see whose cords and staff are these." And so Judah will be told a very nearly identical phrase. So almost payback for this ruse that they're pulling on Jacob, we're going to see in the next chapter. With no reason to suspect any differently, Jacob believes the story as is presented to him. And so again, we have this theme of deception and trickery going on. The deceiver is now the one being deceived. So Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth undergarment over his waist, and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and daughters got up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. So again, Rachel refusing to be comforted for her children. And he said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So he is planning to carry his grief all the way to his grave. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the guard. So next week, we're going to have a brief interlude, and maybe we should spell that with Lewd as we dig into a very sordid story of Judah and Tamar. But after that, we'll pick up the story of Joseph again in 39. So we'll see you next time for Genesis 38 and a very pivotal story in the line of Jesus the Messiah, the story of Judah and Tamar. So we'll see you then.